Gabriel Zarafonitis, president and founder of FarmAnywhere. Thank you so much for joining me on the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Thank you. Same here. It's a privilege.
Yeah, thanks again. I think the listener will knows by now there'll probably be some mention of cultivated because they seem to be the connector for all things related to this show, not only being a sponsor, but we first met in Dubai. It's so funny to meet people from North America, but you meet them on the other side of the world. And we were both there for AgriMe conference. So maybe start there. How did you end up there? And what was that story like?
Well, all I can say is what a ride it's been, right?
Yeah.
Get there to that point, all the way back to the original beginning, I guess that we can say. Yeah, it was a lot of different struggles and a lot of learning at the same time as well, too. That really translates into like what we had at AgriMe, in terms of presentation and product there. It's a long journey that keeps on going and is extremely satisfying, though. I think probably one of the best journey you can have in a lot of careers, I would say.
So was that your first time in the region or had you been there before?
First time in the region, yeah.
Okay. So it was the first time for me as well, just that part of the world. So it was a lot to take in because you're trying to figure out like what the vibe there in Dubai itself. And then the conference was showing all these opportunities that talked ad nauseum on the show about, how much food gets imported there. But if you had to think about what were some of the big takeaways specifically from that trip and being in that region, like what was that like for you?
One main takeaways was the acute understanding from the citizens, the local people about the predicament, I guess, that, they're in and the insane desire to find a solution quickly to that problem, right? That was like constant theme as, we know what the problem is. What can you offer us? What's your solution? Has it been tested before in the desert? What makes you different? Like very pinpointed question. And basically they would just move on to the next and move on to the next booth. And you could see them like coming your way almost down the aisle, so you could see like the eagerness in them.
And so did you refine your pitch as you were having them over the 2 days?
100%. Yeah. One thing that really, we've done pitches in Canada, in the US, and, so you go in thinking that your pitch is as refined as it gets. And then you quickly find out that the need is so different and that the end goal is so different as well, too, that the questions and the KPIs, so to speak, moves. And then you have to adapt quickly, to give them the information that they want.
Yeah. And so rewinding the clock back a little bit, your background is more in project management. Is that where you started your career?
Not even, yeah. My background goes back to my first company when I was 14, doing window cleaning. Yeah. Actually quit high school to go do it and homeschool myself for the rest. So progression of different companies from there on, didn't grow up with any means, you could say. So there was quite a bit of fire in there, right? So went from window cleaning to cleaning, then eventually to a tech company with one of our customers that really liked that solution that we had built. So they completely bought the tech company out. And that tech company was a little bit detrimental to the worker in terms of like their well-being, so to speak, because a lot of tracking and a lot of things like that was happening. So on the next venture, I said, no, this one, I got to do something that actually makes a difference, that will move the needle for the planet. Yeah. So, back then it was quite popular with Steve Jobs saying, if you do something, do it so that you could change the world. So kind of, being a bit of inspired by that there. So that's how I got into like self-taught myself, vertical farming, indoor agriculture. And back then we had, very fundamental equipment, like just Raspberry Pis, right? To be able to control your lights because there was really nothing else unless you wanted to go with controllers with like Siemens, for example, but that was on another level in terms of cost too. Yeah. So basically it was a lot of Jimmy rigging, spending time on the beginning stage of Reddit really back then. And then YouTube, obviously, which is like the main point where we get a lot of information, I guess.
Yeah. I think people who are new to an industry, it's almost like the default. And I think people don't take into account how much you can learn on YouTube and what a resource it is. Even just if I think about the podcasting space, like when I started, like there was some YouTube, but if you think about this world when I was growing up, the internet was a big deal, but even when the internet came up, there was still YouTube took a while to come online. And I think the speed at which you can learn and almost like not make the mistakes that other people have made by watching people on YouTube has been pretty crazy. So it's interesting to see how quickly you can grow and how quickly you can learn a skill set and be well versed in an industry just from YouTube nowadays, which I think a lot of people sometimes take for granted.
Yeah. And not only that, but you can now like, the creators on YouTube, they have like those Discord channels as well too, right? And
Yeah.
those private groups, right? So not only you're learning super quickly with all the different resources, but then you have access also to that little tiny community
Yeah.
on the back end that follows that creator. And then you can glean even more. Like I did this experiment, like for example, one of our container farms is mushrooms, right? And
Yeah.
mushroom is still it's in infancy, you can say,
Yeah.
compared to like leafy greens. So the importance for us to, stay on top of things and see what the community is doing and getting feedback from that, then that's exactly where the best information is by someone just practicing fruiting some mushroom blocks in their basement, really, and just kind of getting information and us at the same time too, sharing that information back. Say, we're not growing in a basement, we're growing maybe in a bit more controlled environment, but
Yeah.
that's what we're seeing with this particular type of equipment, for example.
Yeah. You're in Montreal, is that correct?
No, I'm in Vancouver.
You're in Vancouver, sorry. And then where did you grow up?
I grew up in Montreal, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So about 8 years ago, I moved to Vancouver.
okay. And what was life like growing up in Montreal? I'm curious about this entrepreneurial drive that you have. Is that more of like a culture? Is that more of your environment? Where does that come from?
Well, I think for sure environment played a big role just
Sure.
because it was a need, right? It was a need to create revenue.
Yeah.
It was a need to move. So I guess it did a bit of that drive.
Yeah.
Also, I wasn't that great at school as well too. So that was an extra, I was a bit daydreaming and a bit thinking, playing with Legos as well too, like
Yeah.
earlier on, right? So it wasn't really my thing, I guess. School now it is a bit more, right? Like always being self-taught. So I guess that was like the drive. And then I guess the entrepreneurial spirit, my grandpa had restaurants as well too, being great, in Montreal. So maybe that got transferred to DNA, who knows?
Yeah.
But for sure, there's a natural tendency to go that path, let's say.
And so if I'm ever are there any good Greek diners in Vancouver?
I mean, I haven't been back that much. So no, I think, anyways, from what my grandpa keeps telling me, the heyday of like the really real Greek food coming from Greece through immigration has kind of passed a little bit and it's been diluted in with, for example, Italian food, and Arabic food as well too. So yeah.
It's a shame. I mean, I love Greek cuisine and I grew up in New York and I lived in New York City. So definitely like in Astoria, Queen, there's like no shortage of Greek diners and Greek food. And there's something specifically about that aspect of Mediterranean, like food and culture that it's got its own taste. And it's, as I'm sure you all know. Were you born in Greece?
No, I was not. No, I was born in Montreal. So it's basically my grandpa that came from Greece when he was 14.
Okay. And do you still have family there? Do you ever go back?
So apparently we do have some family there. I've never been to Greece yet. Imagine that. I've been to 30 countries now. I have the goal to do 30 countries under 30.
Okay.
I just revealed my age there, back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, but it's definitely on the bucket list to go to Europe more and go see where my grandpa grew up as well. So that would be cool.
And when you go, I'll introduce you to a previous guest. I'll pull up his name, but he's in Greece and he's doing vertical farming there as well. That would bring it back full circle.
Yeah. Yeah. Any vertical farm that I can visit, I'm down for as well too. I'm big on like, sharing of information.
Yeah.
Maybe even like down to the point where, everything should be open source, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
So I would love to see a farm in Greece or anywhere else in the world for sure.
Yeah. Christos Rafdiogiannis, that's his name, from City Crop. So
from City Crop. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'll let you know when we have the ticket book there.
So you started FarmAnywhere in like you were saying, some of that early technology, 2016, I think is when you started, right? And what were you seeing that had you excited about the space? Because it's still early. And even now we're feeling like this is like I don't know if this would be considered a second wave or a third wave in terms of like vertical farming, but what was it that you saw back then that got you excited about the opportunity?
It was actually a TED Talk that inspired me, the MIT Open Lab. And one of the researchers there, or one of the directors there, was kind of experimenting with, and yet did the analogy between like a food computer, a food server, and then you'd have like some local food production and a bit bigger and a little bit bigger. And it was something that, like inspired me almost right away. into looking into it a bit more, especially with the tech background. Back then, I would say, okay, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do like ultra high tech, right? As high tech as it gets,
Yeah.
which turned out to be a big problem that, was, I guess, hard mistakes to learn, especially 2017, 2018, the years to come after that. Quite ambitious, so to speak, but also that's a big part of the DNA as to what FarmAnywhere is now is because of those early years. I guess now we would say like we're in the flip phone stage of DEA. And back then we were probably at the fax machine, putting things together and just waiting for things to come back. Because the data we couldn't export it. We had to use USB sticks and then stick them in the computer to get the data, right? Couldn't see it live yet and things like that. So
what was the model back then and how has it changed in terms of what your offerings were when you started?
yeah, so back then, right away we went like, okay, we're going to also high. We're going to make our own lights. We're going to make our own controllers. Well, we didn't really have a choice for making our own controllers actually. So, that was a necessity, so to speak. And we're also going to roboticize the whole thing. So, and then another thing too, I'm a big fan of shipping container farms as well too, just because, quick to expand, easy to move around if ever, and hyper local farming, right? Which is still great. Like obviously, that's what FarmAnywhere does, but I do think that there's still a space for traditional vertical farming inside buildings, for example, and all that. There's not a one size fit all. So, but back then we were doing anything that has to do with buildings. It was 100% in containers. We're using reefer containers as well too, which has a whole host of other problems as well. And then we found out pretty quickly that one, robotics is expensive, and it's plagued with issues.
Yeah.
Also, another thing too was, okay, making your own controller is great, but then you have to be able to support those. You got to be able to have the parts for all those as well too. So when you start expanding the farms and all your clients as well too that are operating these farms, you got to be able to support all these farmers. And at the end of the day, you become responsible for their well-being as well, because literally their farm is in your hands. So if you can't support the controllers, if you can't support the robotics, then they're literally in trouble, right? Not just financially, but like a farmer, got to think about it a little bit as a pyramid as well too. As a equipment manufacturer, we're at the top of the pyramid because we're building the tech that people are using. Right underneath that is all the farmers. And then all those farmers, they're working hard to be able to produce the food that's needed. And then after that, you have all of the people that rely on that farmer to produce food, right? So your trickle down effect is literally 10x every single time. So if you have a farm that goes offline, really you stop producing food for maybe, 10, 15, 20,000 people. So, I think that when startups, start and doing the marketing before they even have an actual product and they push out product that hasn't been tested yet, it's not just a farmer that has the consequences of that. It's also everyone else that relies on that.
Yeah, that's a good point because, farmers, they get into it, I would imagine a lot of them because they come from a farming background or they're interested in like the business of farming and getting the product, growing the product and selling it. You start getting into the technical aspects of like maintaining software and looking out for updates and, all the moving parts behind the scenes. It starts to, I would imagine, overwhelm them if that's not their expertise. And if they begin to rely too heavily on tech to get what they need done, one little misstep or one little hiccup or something, one little update that didn't go right in, in the firmware or something, along those lines, thinking about the tech issues, they start to become, it's a really fragile part of the chain.
100%. It's just a question of clicking the wrong switch on the software side and get a call real quick. My HVAC isn't turning on, right? Why is that happening? And so for sure. And it's not necessarily because the end user is necessarily not tech savvy, but like the farmer is not just operating technology in the background, like an IT department at an office, right? Like they're harvesting, they're selling, they're packing, they're cleaning, they're following GAP practices and all that. So it's easy to like just turn around while you had your box, your finger just touch the screen on the way out, right? Then all of a sudden you change something and you didn't even realize it because you're just packing things, getting ready to be able to deliver the food. So definitely having anything built around tech centric in terms of like food production, not only does it have to be user friendly, but it has to be a little bit bulletproof in the sense that you can quickly go back and diagnose an issue if there is. And if anything, the way like our philosophy here for building our tech is that if the controller cannot do it on the software side, there's got to be a physical way to do it and bypass the controller. So either it's like you plug it in straight into the wall and you bypass the relay, right? Or, all kinds of different systems like that so that you could have a physical backup if something happens. And also for the end user, it just helps them be able to troubleshoot issues as well too, because they can take that tech aspect out of the way and just make sure that the physical aspect is working properly first before they go towards the software side and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's definitely important. I definitely want to dive into a little bit of the tech in a second, but when you first looked at the model and you looked at specifically your business model, did you know from day one that you did not want to be in the business of actual farming and be more of the provider and helping people on the tech side?
So I guess you could say like this. So there's a FarmAnywhere 1.0 and there's a
Yeah.
FarmAnywhere 2.0, right?
Okay.
So the 1.0 one was we're going to be 100% manufacture of the tech, right? Like from technology to lights to robotics and all that, which cost us dearly. The company failed, right? Had to close down. And then for a period of about 3 years, I was just kind of floating as a consultant, working on different projects, working for other companies, doing designs for them and things like that. And it's only during the COVID era when we really had like a lot of strain into the industry in terms of the food production industry that went back into like FarmAnywhere 2.0, you could say. And now the philosophy was completely different. It was, we will practice what we preach. So therefore we have a farm in our facility that we grow food in that people actually consume. So a mushroom farm and a leafy green farm.
Okay.
That also doubles as an R&D facility. So we can test out things here and there.
Yeah.
And also by practicing what we preached, and we can give proper advice to potential customers. Yes, this will work and this will not work because, container farm is not the end all be all, right? Like it works in certain aspects, but it doesn't. So by us being in a urban area, but a little bit out the outskirts of Vancouver, we have a really good idea of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in that part. And therefore, we're getting a lot of feedback like that from our own operation as well. And also that doubles as a school as well. So when you get a container from FarmAnywhere, you could come to our facility and get trained. We'll even throw a little bit of booby trap here and there in the containers to help you like try to diagnose, okay, like, this is what it is. Pinch a 1/4-inch tubing, for example, to stop one of the emitters, things like that, just to test out. So, it really became 2.0 really became farmer centric. How can we build a solution that is a tool and not a crutch to the end user, and that they're not necessarily tech savvy, or they're really tech savvy, but not necessarily farmers, to try to find a good balance in between that. And really all that became from literally just exploding the first version of the company, I guess. Like you gotta break things to be able to figure out sometimes your mistakes and then get a reality check, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So for folks that are not familiar with the FarmAnywhere offerings in the model, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Do you provide all in completely set up containers, components, or, just kind of walk people through who you currently serve and what the current offerings are?
Yeah. So when I look back into starting 2.0, basically what I decided to do was okay, we don't need to reinvent the manufacturing process. That's been, proven out. And then we also have the example like Tesla, for example, that can quickly iterate on their software, or not software, on their hardware part and software as well. And then you have the other side of the spectrum, like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, that has huge operations, or car companies, right? So kind of took the time to study a little bit about each of the business models and how the manufacturing part worked. And one thing is always certain between all of them is that they all have a base model. So they have like a base, let's call it the SE model, the light model. So we call it like the universal light farm.
Yeah.
And that's like a combination of like the last years of, me working on different projects where I found like a sweet spot of a farm that's a light shell, has all the equipment in it that you need, and that would produce at scale. So it allows us to be able to use all the economy of scale that you have in the normal manufacturing process. So we build those. And then once we get an order for that farm, also it allows us to keep that container in stock, right? That farm in stock. So a lot of people turn to shipping containers because of speed to market versus like having to pull permits on a regular building and all that. That takes a long time. So that we have in stock. So if you want, we can purchase just the light farm. And the light farm has HVAC, electrical, plumbing, everything that you need to kind of get going. And then you can operate it with your own equipment. So you have an existing greenhouse, for example, with a bunch of nursery carts, and you wanted to like take an extra space out of your nursery and just have a nursery room in a container, you can. You could just have that if you want. And, that's quite affordable as well too, in terms of pricing, and it's fast. So like literally the next day we could ship it out if you're that much in a need, right? And then from there, from that base, then we outfit it with the discipline of the farmer. So either it's mushroom production, leafy greens. We're getting a lot of research R&D as well too, from like universities or private corporations looking to do feed breeding, governmental agencies as well too. So that has a bit more specialized equipment, not really focus on, making a profit, but more focused on really tight controls. And the way we build the containers with an integrated HVAC system as well too. So there's a full duct in there with UV lights, with MERV 13 filters. It allows us to really have 0.5 degree difference between the front and the back of the container, which was
Mm,
a big problem in the past with containers, with it being so long and narrow. And
yeah.
they love that curve to really be able to test out different theories on their crop. And the offering keeps on going from there. We're always looking to fulfill the need if there is. And so, in our internal R&D there, we're testing out a few different methods to be able to fulfill the needs somewhere else, but always following the principles that we've been talking about. So that's the offering. And then we also have a blooming side division, I guess, too, which is just regular agricultural equipment as well, too, like an irrigation skid, probably the
Okay.
most compact irrigation skid you can get. Comes with tank, toasters, pump, and it's within 30 inch by 30 inch. So it's really,
Okay.
really small, up to 150 gallons. So it was built for a container, right? Because of the tight environment. But why not offer it to everyone else? Even other shipping container farm companies, if they want it, they're more than welcome, just to help the market out. And we're going to be developing that in the future as well, too.
Yeah, it sounds like with all the experience you had, having to retrofit or create or maintain equipment specifically for that container farms, it seems like the more you do that, the more you become subject matter experts in terms of the limitations, even just that the designation of the change in degrees, from the front to the back of the unit. Like the more time you spend in that space, it's almost like you start to know the space so well, and you know what works in that space, what doesn't, from crops, from tech, even to the irrigation. And so, do you feel like that's what's been happening? You just become, the more experience you have, the more clients you have, and the more questions you have about the limitations of that space, the more you start to understand what's possible and what you can do there.
Yeah, definitely the feedback from our customers as well too, that also some of them, they like to experiment, right, themselves. So say, hey, here we tried to do this and it, didn't really work out, or it worked great, right? So also because we're really open as a company, even to the point where, eventually I'd like to maybe even go to the open source kind of model. It goes both ways with our customers. When they contact us, we're super open about how things are done, why we're doing them in a certain way. And then that kind of gets back to us as well too. When they start operating the farm, they're super open about sharing their information about what trials they've done and all that. And in terms of like manufacturers, a lot of them say, if you use the container in a way that is not meant, you void your warranty, right? And then it basically stops the customer from giving you feedback because they're scared that you're going to avoid the warranty if
Yeah.
they break something, right? And us, it's the opposite, because we use only off the shelf parts. We don't develop anything. We do system integration, right? So the process, we put it all together, and we don't need to do tech ourselves, for example, on the controller side, because now there's a bunch of companies doing that tech. So let's just take the best technology possible. That's the simplest and easiest to maintain. Let's implement that into the container. And if the end user or farmer breaks that controller, it's not us that has, like, we will help you with the warranty, but at the end of the day, the manufacturer of that controller that will warranty it, right? So it allows us to have a special relationship kind of with our customer in that sense too, and quick feedback and a lot of collaborative work as well.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. I think people are always concerned about proprietary systems and trade secrets and, obviously, people copying designs. And I think this talk of open source coming from the tech and the software background, which you've had experience in, why is that approach important for you and why is that something you've adopted?
Well, two reasons. The first reason is that at the end of the day, if you're so worried about your patents and your proprietary tech and all that, really the only person that it is detrimental to is the farmer, because it's harder for them to fix the unit. It's harder for them to get
Hmm.
parts for the unit as well too. If a company, and we've had a bunch of examples of that, if a company goes bankrupt and they have a bunch of proprietary lights, and a bunch of proprietary controllers, it's the farmer at the end of the day that face the consequences, just a quick Google and you'll see a bunch of examples on that. So that's the number one reason why I think us being able to use open source parts, not open source parts, but off the shelf parts that can be quickly acquired to more warning and, is important in that sense. And then the second part too is because of the whole tech industry, VCs were looking for tech, right? They were looking for, that's how they make money. So the companies were extremely incentivized to have proprietary tech so that they could raise their next Series A, their next Series B. And that also became detrimental to that. So there's a few companies out there that do it really, really well. Let them do well. They do lights well. Great. Excellent. If you have amazing lights, I want to hear from you, right? We will implement them. If you make amazing controllers, I want to hear from you. If you do amazing filters for your irrigation, I want to hear from you. You do that, great. Focus on that. Make it your baby. Make sure that it's the best in the world, and we'll implement it for the end user. And another part that I want to add about the whole patenting and being super secretive about everything that you do is that if you're so busy with like your secrecy and all that, it means you have to have a big team, right? You have to have a huge dev team and a huge mechanical engineer team because you're doing everything from zero when technology already exists. And that trickles down to the cost of your product as well, too. And it also trickles down to, as we've seen lately, mass layoffs when that money runs out, right? When the VC stops writing you a check, there's only so much you can take with, especially in the vertical farming industry with 15, 20,000 employees, maybe not that much, but I'm going off maybe a bit more traditional tech here, but it's expensive to be able to run all of these projects internally. And if the technology already exists, we shouldn't have to redo it from scratch. And the market is big enough. That's the reality as well too, right? I don't know, maybe if you're in a competitive industry like aerospace with like Boeing and Airbus, where there's only two companies, you could see how, that's quite cutthroat business right there in terms of proprietary information. But the need is so great at this moment to be able to have food produced around the world that if you have a good product, there's more than enough space for everyone.
And I think that's what I've seen as a consistent story, with this idea of all hands on deck. It's an important moment that everyone is involved. There's not time to have this competition mindset as opposed to cooperation mindset. And I think I love the idea of supporting the farmers and having that be the basis for your decision making, right? Because I think I heard something on a podcast like last week about Ford, right? When he created the Ford Model T, those first models, I think you could repair anything with like home tools, like I think wrenches and something like that. So it was interesting because there was this idea of like, there wasn't the infrastructure that's in place now and all these proprietary parts and all that stuff, but just that idea that at any point, and even me growing up, like my dad taught me how to change the shocks on a car and change the oil in the car and just kind of the basic that everyone needs to know. But nowadays, like they're so like fancy and so many like computers and electronics, and it's overwhelming. Like most people wouldn't even like open the hood of their car now because they're just like, there's too much and there's something that's overwhelming. And I think there's something to be said for being able to, just lift up the hood of your farm and just say, hey, what's wrong? How can I fix it? And I love the fact that you build in a couple of these tests in the beginning to get people comfortable with just like rolling their sleeves up and just diagnosing their own problems.
You could never break it too much, right? Like it's always, you can always fix it. There's always a backup somewhere. And it gives them confidence to be able to tinker a little bit with it. Like the perfect example of like cars being extremely complicated now, and you don't want to touch that anymore. Too much tech.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you think about container farms and the conversations I've had, Gabriel, I think about it as three different phases. There's the brand new farmer just getting started with their first container farm. And then the one who's had some success, and then they're looking for like add-ons, figuring out how to scale that. And then probably the other one would be partnering with a grocery store, with a hospital, and then seeing maybe the hospital itself saying, hey, we need something, we want to try this out. Research R&D is something you mentioned as well. So what do you think about that mix? Is there another phase that I haven't thought about? And, where are you seeing in terms of the folks you're doing business with along that spectrum, like how are people engaging with you?
There's no doubt that probably compared to like the greenhouse, for example, industry, or maybe traditional indoor, inside warehouses, for example, we get a lot more beginner growers, right? Someone that comes from a corporate background, for example, sick and tired of doing 9 to 5 and wants to do something different. So for sure. Our ratios are greater on that part. So it's a responsibility for us as well to educate them properly and have, I think what we're seeing as well too from customers that are shopping around between different manufacturers, the ability for us to tell them, you know what, this may not work for what you're doing compared to what we're hearing is like, oh yeah, buy it, like everything works and it'll be amazing. It's best tech ever, right? Like thing, yeah, plug and play, right? We hear plug and play all the time. And, you know, arguably we could say that our containers are plug and play because there's an actual plug that plugs into the back so you can move the container around instead of have it hard connected. Same thing for the water intake. It's an actual water plug, like a hose bed connection. So we could technically claim plug and play if we wanted to, but we don't because every farm has a dial-in period. So it's important to set, you know, expectations on that side of, I'd say probably 45% of our leads from newer growers. Then we have like traditional farmers that are also looking to learn, especially the newer generation. They're like, yeah, like my parents have a dairy farm, for example, or have a traditional cover crop, but I'm interested in doing something during the winter months or doing cow feed, for example, with fodder. So that will be another part. And then you get to the other spectrum, which is like government agencies and big corporations that are looking to buy either a lot of containers or they're looking to put containers here and there to be able to cover. So Caribbean islands, right? That's a big one. Government agencies to be able to provide food security to their customers. And it's a bit of a challenge for sure on our side because the needs are so great between, you know, a big corporation and a government agency. The questions are a whole lot different, you know, in between all of those spectrums. But I think you covered the spectrums of potential customers, potential users as well, quite well there.
So having that experience with new farmers, I'm always interested because I'm always excited to see people entering this space. What are some misconceptions that first-time farmers have about getting into this business?
Well, you know, if you just scroll on LinkedIn and if you follow a lot of people in the vertical farming space, you'll hear all the time, like new startups save 99% on your water consumption compared to traditional farming. So that's what they expect, right? And it's like, those numbers are really paperwork. It's how you're going to measure really. I'd like to see your study on how you measure 99% less water than that. So a lot of it is also setting expectations on it's not plug and play. It's not like you go to Apple Store and open up your MacBook and it's ready to go. There is work to be done in it as well.
Yeah.
There's cleaning, not glamorous, right? You will have pest problems as well too. Yes, you know, there is a lobby at the front that protects against, you know, outside environment as much as you can, but you still have to follow your SOP. It's not going to be easy there. It's not a white lab coat that you see all the pictures on with the purple lights or the purple lights. There's quite a bit of hard work involved into it. And then once they kind of accept that fact, then you'll see a clear divide. It's either all in or, you know, all out and say, you know what, actually, that's not for me anymore. I'd rather just go back to my stand-up desk and calm down.
Yeah. And then also this idea of having offtake agreements in place or just understanding the marketing aspect of it, I think as well, because I think they can run a successful farm. They can grow crops successfully and understand that process really, really well. But there's the business side of it, the marketing side of it, right? You need to understand what you're getting into and who's actually going to be purchasing these crops that you're growing.
Huge. Yeah. I do kind of believe a little bit if you build it, they will come, right? Because there's such a need. We would have to talk about this again in 5 to 10 years to see if that's still true. But for sure, before you even consider any sort of equipment, which is even like, if you wanted to start with microgreens, grow tent in your spare bedroom, go out first in your community, go talk to the farmer's market, go talk to the local grocery store and ask them, what do you need? What's your pain point before you do anything else? And once you have that data, you know, that feedback, then you know where to go. Because you may think that microgreens, for example, is like a big thing because there's a lot of marketing around it. There are a lot of influencers who are pushing microgreens, and microgreens is great, right? But it's becoming saturated more and more. So, you know, you may have a really low hanging fruit like potatoes or carrots, for example, that are there and that you just need soil and, you know, you may not need to have like a fancy equipment. And it just gets your feet wet a little bit as well too with the whole supply chain side too, because it's not just I harvest and I deliver. There's certain standards you have to follow as well for cleanliness, especially in North America. So also they don't necessarily want to produce anytime that you're ready to harvest, right? They'll want it for the weekend, the restaurants, for example. So all that you got to, you know, really get into it first and kind of understand that. And only then you can really plan a big operation.
Do you find that the folks that work with you, do they start to talk to each other? Do they start to learn about best practices, what's working, what's not? Do they get to share some of those things that are working for them in their own farms?
In between each other, I haven't seen it yet, but you kind of do see a little bit of a community on Reddit, for example,
Oh,
or
yeah.
on Facebook, sharing that information in between one another. Or you see a lot of trade shows as well too, like, hey, I tried this and it works really well. Yeah, for sure, there could be something better. If you need a startup idea to negotiate, maybe some sort of LinkedIn for indoor farming, that would be,
Yeah, that is something. I've seen a couple of different like WhatsApp groups, and I've thought about some ideas. Our page, Vertical Farming Podcast, gets a lot of followers, but there's something to be said. And I think probably Reddit is probably a good place to start. There's probably container farm, specifically groups that you'll get all the questions there, I'm sure, to start. Based on your visibility in terms of like the different tech solutions you use, you mentioned controllers, irrigation systems. Are you seeing anything that's interesting for you in terms of innovation that's happening within the container space in terms of the different components?
yeah. So if you would have asked me like 6 months ago, for sure, you were seeing a lot of like AI,
Yeah.
a lot of like really complicated systems that need like text to be sent out basically for install, right? And then that kind of slowed down a little bit with a few companies either being bought out or just slashing their staff around. So, and then what came back up from that was more simple controllers. It kind of looks like rinky dink, you could say, in terms of like, the polishing of the product, the end product.
Yeah.
But definitely there was a bit of a sense, like a bit of a reset towards simplicity of use and be able to deploy quickly. Like, for example, like Pulse, it's just a sensor array, but it's literally you plug in, you log in, and you're good to go. We use a lot of Control Master, which was born out of the cannabis industry. Thank you for the cannabis industry, by the way, for vertical farming, just because they push so much R&D and money into it that now we're capable of doing it for leafy greens at a more reasonable price on the LED lights, for example. And
Okay.
so we use Trollmaster because there's no control wires really. It's RJ12 plug, like basically a telephone plug between each of the controllers. So if ever you had a failure on your device, you can literally just unplug it and plug it back in and you're ready to go. And for remote communities, we can even send an extra array of sensors just in case. Sensors is something that, gets uncalibrated often or even breaks someone, steps on it or whatever the case may be, squishes it in between, two racks, for example. So we could throw an extra sensor to them and instantly get back online, right? So big fan of that company as well too. So really seeing a big push on staying away from the AI parts for now, but it will probably come back. I think AI has a space, a part in it, especially for teaching farmers actual plant methodology of it, like not the plant, what word should I be using here? Chlorosis and all that, being able to read the plant light, right? I think that's someone that's quite light on, and video AI will definitely help that as well too, once we get to that point.
And do you see the difference when farmers implement the sensors in terms of like their ability to have more insight in what's happening inside their farm?
Yes, especially when they also have a baseline curve to go off of as well too. It gives them like that confidence. So a good example of that is when we finish our product, like a container farm, we never just ship it out. It goes outside into a QA/QC bay, plug it in, and we actually run the container for 3-4 days. And we put it through its spaces, bring the temperature up to 30 Celsius, 110 Fahrenheit, bring it back down to just above freezing, add humidity, test the lights and all that. And then after that, for the last 48 hours, we run the container how it's supposed to be run. So if you're doing leafy greens, we'll run it with the proper CO2, the proper temperature and all that. And that gives them that baseline. So when they get the container after that, when it gets delivered, they see that graph onto their portal and allows them to say, as they're starting the operation, they can match that line to what's existing and give them confidence. And eventually they take their own wings and fly. But for sure, if someone were to develop some sort of like learning assistant like that to kind of give just a little bit of a curve, those newer beginner farm operators would have more confidence because there's a bit of a panic that sets in, I guess, a little bit too, when it becomes real. And then, when you panic, it's just 10 times worse, right? So yeah, if someone wants to do something that's an AI based camera that helps farmers with like baselines, you got something there for sure. That's simple to use and affordable as well too. Yeah, that's your KPI if you want to do a startup like that.
What's interesting is as I hear you talk about your approach, I can really see your tech background, your project management background, because we talk about things like SOPs, we talk about KPIs, we talk about QCing equipment. These are all things that, from a learning and going through those experiences in tech projects, how important it is to have all those, you know, dot your I's, cross your T's, and make sure you're putting out something. Because if you put in that work ahead of time and you do that prep and you go through that flight checklist, right? And you're saying, what are the things we need to know before we put this in the hands of our customers? You're going to save yourself so much trouble, and there's some learnings for you because, you're pushing your farms to the limit and seeing where it's breaking. So I think, and that's a feedback loop for you, right? And it's very, very helpful. It's very interesting to see how that your background in tech has inspired you for some of those decisions.
For sure. I mean, we don't need to be inventing any wheels here. Like all of those processes, they've always like existed. They've always been implemented, right? So
Yeah.
it's just a question of figuring out what process works best for what you're doing,
Mhm.
like your flight checklisting. Pilots do that for a reason. And it happens sometimes that you're about to fly and the pilots are on and say, you know what? Something's off with the motor on the left. We can't go
Yeah.
off, right? Thank you for the checklist. So
Yeah.
farm operators have checklists, manufacturers have checklists. And I would actually encourage if you're looking for equipment for your vertical farm, whether it's lights or controllers, ask the manufacturer, do you have a QA/QC checklist? And if so, can I see it? Because, certain things for sure, you may want to keep that kind of process a little
Yeah.
bit more discreet, but if they want to provide them, if they do have a checklist and they want to provide it to you, that's a big, big points to be given to that manufacturer because you know that they're going through that process every time an equipment and they're just not sending equipment out willy-nilly without testing it.
And for the listener, it's clear that FarmAnywhere follows those policies. That's a good thing to know. So where are you seeing the most opportunity for FarmAnywhere? For looking, this industry is growing so fast, right? So even just looking out 12 months is a lot. But given what you've seen so far, the implementations you've done, the conferences you've been attending, you know, where are you seeing the most opportunities specifically for FarmAnywhere in terms of growth?
For sure, in terms of growth, Caribbean are very big as well too.
Yeah.
South America, very big, and Middle East as well too. Huge, right? Those are two hot markets for growth. And then in terms of technology or equipment, you know, for us, it would be to have packages that are easier to get into. A good example of that would be, LED is saturated. So there don't need to be into LEDs. Same thing with HVAC systems. Companies have been around for 100 years, but putting packages together where someone can take a racking system from someone, like a plant system, lids and tray for someone, and then come to us for the irrigation skid. That's a good example, or come to us for a side, like a 20-foot container just for a nursery to be able to expand. And then that brings me to my next point where existing farm operations are noticing the ability that containers have or the ability to convert an existing shed, for example, into a vertical farm, right? So like a nursery, a greenhouse, for example, contact us to be able to put a container beside their greenhouse to do the nursery part and just kind of rescue that space, especially that square footage is becoming so much more expensive in big urban sprawls.
Yeah.
Being able to reuse that square footage for multiple reasons, for multiple use is big, right?
What's a tough question you've had to ask yourself recently?
Are we moving fast enough to be able to provide that need? That was a big point. I actually went to Bermuda for a project 2 weeks ago, but the week before that, I took a few days off, first vacation in like a year.
Yeah.
And was asking kind of, those tough questions there as you have that step back and was like, okay, are we moving fast enough to be able to meet the market demand? And what is the biggest weakness that we have to improve on in terms of either like for us is like, what's our biggest weakness in terms of manufacturing to make sure that we're still putting out a good product and meet the demand that way sure we're not cutting any corners, put proven technology. Sometimes manufacturers are forced a little bit to like push out newer tech or newer physical hardware that hasn't been yet proven out yet, just because either supply chain or whatever it is, right? So those are pretty much, the tough questions at the moment now. I think, if you were to ask me again in 3 months, it'd be quite different. For example, we don't spend that much into marketing.
Yeah.
We let the product speak for itself.
Yeah.
But maybe, we should put ourselves out a little bit more. All questions like that, I guess any CEO, and agricultural equipment manufacturer should ask themselves as well too, just to stay on top of things,
Yeah, that's a good point. One thing I thought of is thinking about all these conferences that are all these remote locations. Has anyone thought of launching an indoor farming conference somewhere in the Caribbean? Because I'm sure they'd get a lot of people to
Oh,
attend.
100%. Yeah, that's such a big need there as well too, Middle East gets a lot of attention in terms of conferences in Europe as well too, but Caribbean is definitely a place that really needs some sort of conference for sure. South America
And
as
in
well too.
and in terms of like, pulling these founders or these conferences away from their families, I think you can make a good case. They could make it a family trip. Once it's somewhere in the Caribbean, it makes it easier conversation.
Definitely a good spot to go for sure. For sure, for sure. Yeah.
Gabriel, I'm curious because of what you experienced through COVID, challenges with supply chain disruptions. That was a very big wake up call for folks in the industry, and especially for someone like you who's very dependent on, your manufacturing capabilities and redundancies. So what did that do for you? And how did you think differently, maybe pre-COVID and like post-COVID? And, how do you think about those challenges going forward?
Well, when we raised a seed round of investment for FarmAnywhere 2.0, it was really in the middle of COVID, right? So we didn't like really have to deal with the impact before COVID, through COVID. We were towards the 3/4 way through COVID. So we had the opportunity to at least be able to know what was going on, like learn from other people and make proper steps so that if there were to be another COVID, hopefully not, right? But if there were to be, we wouldn't be as impacted. So one of those was like to source everything locally.
Yeah.
Very little that comes from overseas. A lot of our wholesalers and suppliers, because we qualify as OEM very often as well too. So we get from either Vancouver or the UN very close. Because like our trays, for example, or plastic trays and things like that. So it allows us to weather supply chain issues in that sense. And hopefully that pays off in the long run as well too. And it definitely does pay off in terms of quality of the actual product too, by either doing everything ourselves. So that's another thing. We have our own electrician, our own plumber, our own spray foam booth, our own paint booth as well too, their own painting. There's really nothing that gets done outside, our own HVAC tech as well too. So that allows us to also weather their problems and also allows us to control the quality of the work throughout the process and have a lot of communication between the electrician and the plumber and the painter and make sure that the processes are smooth in between them and that everything kind of gets married together into one final product, one final system integration. So that plays a big role as well for the supply chain issues there.
Yeah, it's good. It's great to see how much you've built in, and the fact that it was a wake up call puts you in a position to make sure that you're prepared for that going forward, which is great. So as we wrap up, I've been leaving some space at the end of these conversations because of the nature of this audience. It's a lot of your colleagues in the space, a lot of folks in vertical farming, your fellow CEOs and founders. Is there a message that you have for the industry that you'd like to, talk to people about, or just, I'd like to kind of give you the stage for that?
Yeah, if anything, we are at the beginning again, flip phone stage of this era. There is no need to act like competition, like big corporate entities, right? I think that we should collaborate together, work on our strength. Everyone has strength. And I think we should stop trying to do everything and do one thing really, really good and then collaborate together. And at the end of the day, the end user is the priority. And that's what we want. We want the end user, the farmer operator to benefit from that tech and not be hindered by it, like we see many, many times. So the focus should definitely be moving towards open sourcing our tech as much as possible and always have the farmer at the center of the problem solving that we're doing constantly.
I really appreciate that you said that. I think there's going to be more of a movement, I feel, towards more of the open source, and just people who vibe with that ethos, I think, are going to start collaborating, and probably you'll start to see some sites where people can like share best practices. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be for the benefit of the entire industry. So I love the fact that you've talked about it and we've brought it up on this show. Based on your experience in the industry, it's almost like you're a veteran now in the space. If you can say something like that, because of the experiences you had, but also the ups and downs that you've had, and then also how it's been interesting to hear how your background in tech has really put you in this position to learn, best practices. And so I think what you're doing is amazing. I'm really glad we got connected, and I'm really appreciate you taking some time to share your story and your background.
Thank you. Yeah. Same here too as well. Thanks for be able to start that conversation too with everyone. You're at your 167 podcast now or something like that.
No, we're closing in on 100, and then I have a couple of other interviews in the can, but definitely within the next couple of months, we'll cross the 100 mark. It's crazy because I was thinking about, I thought I'd been doing it for 2 years, but actually this March is 3 years of the show. It's amazing how I thought I was going to have like a couple of, couple dozen interviews and then the show is going to be over. I was like, oh, I spoke to everybody. But every conference I go to, I come back with like a stack of cards. So it's exciting. And then I have people coming back to give updates on the industry. And so it's exciting to have just found it at the time when the excitement has picked up again and to get to tell these stories. It's something to see the company from the outside, but I love this ability to sort of tell your personal story because everyone has been entering the industry through different paths. And there's no one path because it's such a new industry, which I love to hear about.
Yeah, I really do appreciate the way you ask and formulate your questions when you're interviewing all the different those, because a lot of times I'm listening and I'm like, oh yeah, like, yeah, I want to know that question. Like the question you just asked there, like,
Yeah.
it allows to be able to have information sharing and learn quite a bit from others. And, sometimes same situations, sometimes different situations. And I think that will just help us move the industry way, way, way further
Yeah.
ahead there with what you're doing. A lot of people think like podcasts is just like an entertainment thing. A lot is true. Some of them, there's not a lot of information, but I think what you bring there makes definitely, anyways, in my experience, it makes a big difference
Yeah.
in the industry to be able to share that information that you kind of claw out of the CEOs there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I come from a podcasting background. I started my first show. It's called Podcast Junkies, where I interview other podcasters. So that was my entry into the podcasting world. 310 interviews there. So I definitely cut my teeth with long form interviews and got really comfortable with them. But I always tell people in a podcast conversation, there's three people. There's the host, the guest, and then the listener. And to never forget, there's someone listening to the podcast, someone listening to this conversation right now. And bringing them into the conversation, including them in the conversation. And I'm really glad you said that. Like I've been in that position myself where you want them to ask that follow-up question. You're saying like, oh yes, I'm glad you did that. Because a lot of times new podcasters, they'll have a piece of paper and they'll ask their 5 questions and then they won't go deep or they won't be curious or they won't pull the threads. And I think that's where the best, stories come from and where the best conversations come from. So I appreciate and I'm glad that the podcast is adding value for you as well.
Thanks. Yeah. Do you ever get feedback from the actual listener directly as to what they would like to see in the future? Like, how do you like interact with the listeners of the podcast to be able to get that feedback?
A couple of different ways. So regular listeners will know that you can go to ratethispodcast.com/VFP and they can leave a rating and a review. And then I read those out on the air, which I really enjoy doing. I've got people just connecting with me on LinkedIn. They said, hey, Harry, you don't know me. I just found your podcast. I've listened to all the episodes. And now I'm closing in on 90 to 100 episodes. So like, I don't know if people can listen to the entire catalog, but what's happening is they're entering the industry and they want to know like who and what's happening. And this is something that a growing industry and they're getting so much information from the podcast that they're letting me know. And so they'll reach out on LinkedIn, occasionally a DM on the socials. That's why it was important that I have all the social channels. So they usually find a way, Harry at verticalfarmingpodcast.com. So I always, as a podcaster, feedback is like your gold, like it's your fuel. I want to know, like when people hear the show, I went to Indoor AgCon and I asked the question in one of the panels and I said, yeah, I'm Harry from Vertical Farming Podcast. And so after the panel, like 3 or 4 people came up to me like, oh, well, like, I love the show. Like I've been listening and someone was standing next to me like, oh, you're Harry. Cause my face is not anywhere on the podcast and maybe I'll change that soon. But but what's funny is that like, oh, I recognized your voice. They just, especially, you start to hear someone week in and week out, you get to know what that person sounds like. And when they're in person, it feels some funny sometimes. And as a podcaster, I should be used to it, but it's interesting.
Yeah. You've ever thought of doing the YouTube form as well too? Like basically just recording exactly
Yeah.
in terms of for recognition, I guess.
Yeah. So I think what I have a lot of it recorded. And so it's just now a function of getting through the back catalog and starting to put those on YouTube. And then obviously sharing with the guests, getting their okay to put that on. But I do have the plan for in the next month or two, getting the entire back catalog on and then going forward, having it on YouTube and people start to recognize me once they get it.
Yeah. That's my primary form of doing podcast too as well. I'll go on YouTube and just have a little something going on the computer, while we're doing
exactly
and all that.
It is the number 2 search engine. So it's important that we get the content on YouTube as well. So that's part of the plan. So thank you for that reminder and we'll start to get that.
All good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks
So
for sharing your experience.
Yeah, of course. The FarmAnywhere.ag for folks to learn more about you and the company. Anywhere else you want to send people to get connected with you?
You can do farm_anywhere on Instagram if you'd like to as well. Again, we're not fancy schmancy on polished marketing yet, but yeah, just go on our website and pick up the phone. Like we have a 1-800 number on purpose wherever you're in the world. Give us a call. Of course, emails is fine too, but we're always there to be able to take your calls and start the conversation going as well to anywhere you are in the world and any issue that you want. And also, if you have interesting tech that you think would be interesting for us to look at, to be able to implement and to give out to our farmers as part of our package solution, reach out as well to us. We have a little form there on the website. If you have something to share with us like that, I'm more than willing to have a look at that as well too. And also a good way is to have a look at Cultivated's website, right? They're partners. There's a bunch of tech there as well if you're looking for equipment and things like that.
I appreciate you sharing your time and your story. Thanks, Gabriel.
Thanks. Yeah, you too.